Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more 40k lore. Today we're going to have a look at the Imperial Guard, and more correctly, how they prefer engaging various tactical and strategical problems. In other words, I'm going to explain to you how the Imperial Guard likes to destroy various things, be it planets, enemy navies, enemy armies, etc. I'm thinking of going through all of the races like this eventually, so if there is a particular race you want to see, then do pop that down in the comment section, and if one appears to be nice and popular, then that'll probably be next. But back to the Imperial Guard. We'll start out with ground forces. The Imperial Guard has access to innumerable billions of men spread across millions of regiments, some heavily specialized to achieve certain tasks or to suit specific environments like Talan Desert Raiders or Assault Engineers of the Meridian Iron Guard. The brave men and women of the Imperial Guard also has access to a vast number of armoured vehicles and support weapons, be it artillery, AAA, or more exotic weapons like void shields or titans, though granted titans are technically under the command of the Adeptus Mechanicus, though they usually do stride into battle at the, well, while not exactly the command of local Imperial commanders, at the request of Imperial commanders would probably be a more correct way of putting it. Nevertheless, though, the Guard has some standardized tactics and doctrines that it uses as a basis for further planning, and since it would be fairly impossible to write about every single one of the Guard regiments and their preferred way of war, I will cover here the basics as well as a few special scenarios. Never fear though, we might just get to some of the more unique regiments in time. Preferably, before beginning a ground campaign, the Imperium will establish void dominance around the planet they wish to invade. Worst case scenario, they will at the very least try for void equality, so that any enemy ships can't freely move around in the space around the planet. This is a fairly vital part of the operation, as losing void superiority has quite a few drawbacks, particularly for the attacker, as losing void superiority not only means that you lose the opportunity to conduct bombardments from orbit, but you also run the risk of getting bombed yourself. Additionally, bringing down extra supplies and reinforcements is also considerably complicated by not having void superiority. Additionally, the Imperial Guard usually deploys its fighter craft and bombers from orbiting spaceships, as they are all under command of the Imperial Navy, at least in the early stages of an invasion, when proper airfields have not yet been established by the Imperial Guard's ground elements. And perhaps most vital of all, without the proper countermeasures at hand, a ground force runs a rather serious risk of being simply wiped out by orbital bombardment. However, it should be noted that carrying out such a bombardment is quite a complex task and puts the bombarding ships at great risk both from ground-based planetary defense weapons and from other ships. This later threat is particularly grave as a ship conducting orbital bombardment has to maintain geosynchronous orbit to have any real chance of actually hitting something. In space terms, this means the ship has to slowly coast to a virtually complete halt above the planet and rotate its broadside to face the planet below, making the ships, for all intents and purposes, virtually defenseless. This means that all a defending fleet has to do to deny the enemy the opportunity to bombard is to stay within range of their own forces. A fairly simple task in space warfare where effective range is largely decided by the enemy's ability to avoid rather than sheer distance. And as we have already mentioned, a massive-ass kilometer-long, and in some cases up to a dozen-kilometer-long spaceship sitting still above a planet is not very nimble. As such, hitting it is a fairly simple task, even at, quite literally, astronomical distances. Additionally, it takes a long time for one of the massive spacefaring behemoths of the 41st millennium to get into the exact position to carry out a bombardment. This means that even if the attacker fleet can chase off the defender, it is far easier for the defender to get back into position to attack the bombarding fleet than it is for the bombarding fleet to get into position. In other words, to effectively bombard a planet, the fleet needs to either destroy the defender or outnumber them to such an extent that a part of the fleet can keep them at bay while the remaining ships carry out the bombardment. And even then, it is certainly not without its risks, as since the ships are virtually at a complete standstill with just some minor movements of the planet to keep it in geosynchronous orbit, even extreme long-range munitions has a very, very good chance of scoring hits, which means that the attacking fleet that is defending the bombarding fleet not only has to keep the enemy fleet at range, therefore out of effective firing range of lance weapons, but they also need to intercept and destroy any torpedoes or large-scale missile attacks. So 'tis not easy by any stretch of the imagination. But even with void superiority, it is still not a given that a fleet can carry out an effective attack from orbit. Given how devastating a bombardment is, most large-scale forces will bring along some countermeasures. In most cases, as far as the Imperium is concerned, this countermeasure usually takes the form of a massive fuck-off fleet. This particular approach to warfare has long been known as the "I have a much bigger dick than you, therefore you should surrender." And while this age-old stratagem is undoubtedly effective, it is a sad fact that some races are not impressed by sheer size alone, and will require further convincing. In these cases, the size of the Imperial fleet serves a dual purpose. It is not only impressive, but also a space-faring continent's worth of weapons and ammunition shops, food processing plants, troop ships, landers, and everything a budding army requires, including considerable numbers of camp followers that regiments accumulate over the course of their campaigns. Most large-scale fleets that are sent to aggressively assault planets are almost entirely self-sufficient when it comes to military goods, only requiring occasional replenishments of material to continue production if the targeted world proves to be more resilient than originally anticipated. In extreme cases, entire Imperial crusades can be ran and supplied entirely by the fleet, using specialized Mechanicum ships to harvest resources from nearby planets. However, worst case scenario, assuming that this is not possible, that the fleet has been defeated somehow, Imperial Guard regiments do have a couple other halfway decent countermeasures, usually in the form of mobile void shields that will provide at least a measure of defense against orbital bombardment. Although, to be honest, as far as the Imperial Guard is concerned, if you don't have any kind of fleet superiority, or at least fleet equity, the best choice is really to split the Imperial Guard regiments into smaller forces, thereby making it extremely hard for the enemy to bombard them effectively. And again, it's a bit of a risk-reward thing. If the Imperial Guard has any sort of naval presence left in the system, most enemies will be reluctant to send parts of their fleet into the rather vulnerable position that is an orbital bombardment if all they can hope to hit are small troop concentrations. Nevertheless, this is only an idea for extreme cases. Pretty much any and all Imperial Guard campaigns will be launched with the assumption and the requisition of, at the very least, void equity, and planned with void superiority in mind, since it is simply the easiest, most effective, and by far most cost-efficient way to protect ground forces from orbital bombardment. Then, assuming that void superiority has been acquired, the Imperial Navy's first task is then to deposit the Guard onto the planet. Troops and armored vehicles are transported first, followed swiftly by Mechanicum elements that will begin to establish a forward base camp and the basic facilities required for transporting supplies and men from orbit. Once this is complete, the fleet will, if possible, begin eliminating any center of resistance big enough to be effectively hit from orbit. Once these targets of opportunity have been well and truly glassed, the main part of the fleet will maintain positions above the planet where it can provide further support, while lighter and faster elements are dispatched to the outer rim of the system to keep an eye out for uninvited guests. Now, How the Imperial Guard gets onto the planet, however, is a bit of an interesting one, so let's quickly look at how the troops get on the ground before moving on to the air war. Over the years, the Imperial Army and then later the Imperial Guard have developed a whole host of ways to deliver fighting men to the surface of planets in a more or less consistent and safe way. Preferably, the lead guard elements will be landed directly onto the planet in gargantuan landing crafts that could best be described as flying fortresses. Some large enough to transport entire regiments along with their support weapons and armor onto the surface while pumping out a virtual torrent of firepower to cover itself. A somewhat more hazardous but faster way is to deploy light regiments in gunships and platoon-sized landers. This obviously has the advantage in speed and requires far less space to put down, but the units on the ground will be unable to bring along anything but light scout vehicles and sentinels, and will also forego the heavy support fire of the heavy landers. Besides these rather mundane ways of transportation, the Guard also has access to old and heavily specialized tech like a heavy anti-grav lander that projects an area of low gravity beneath itself that lets troops simply step off the transport and slowly sink to the ground. This means that the troops can be dropped onto almost any terrain with acceptable levels of risk, but it also means that the transport has to stay perfectly stationary over the drop zone for long enough to deploy hundreds, if not thousands of troops. As you can imagine, this makes it a damn tempting target for anyone nearby with a grudge against their new liberators. And lest we forget, this anti-grav beam is run by an extremely old generator operated by a bunch of robed zealots that think opening a maintenance hatch requires lengthy religious sermons and the burning of incense. In most cases, however, such exotic means of deployment are rarely used without a very specific reason. Even the heavy landing craft are usually only used when the local commander deems it necessary to land virtually on top of the enemy and employ some good old-fashioned shock and awe tactics, and the Adeptus Astartes are busy elsewhere. In most cases, troops are simply shuttled down via bulk lifter transport, a generic term that refers to large-scale but slow non-military, or in some cases even semi-military, cargo ships equally well or equally ill-suited for carrying raw resources, as they are troops. Now, again, most cases these will be civilian ships that have been confiscated and then dragged into service. In some cases, they will be very, very old and unreliable military vessels, and in some cases they will simply be, in, for example, the case of a crusade, civilian transports that was requisitioned so long ago that they've been modified over the years by their crew to be essentially military vessels at this point, with upgraded engines, perhaps even just a tiny bit of shielding and a few guns. But before any of these options can be deployed, the ships carrying the troops need to get into position to release them. The exact position required obviously varies greatly depending on how the troops are deployed. For example, a drop by landers can be carried out thousands of kilometers away from their final destination, as the landers use their own engines to travel to the final drop point. This does, of course, put them at a considerable risk from enemy countermeasures like anti-orbital weapons and AAA, along with the planet's own air intercept capabilities. A drop directly onto the final destination is therefore preferred, but this again means that the spaceship itself has to assume a nearly stationary position above the drop zone. This is not quite as hard or as risky as an orbital bombardment, but is usually avoided in the face of an opposing fleet. There are some races, though, that not only can deploy effectively directly into a combat zone like this with negligible risk to their spacecrafts, but have in fact specialized in it. The most obvious example is the Adeptus Astartes and their use of drop pods and high-speed, heavily armed Thunderhawk transports, along with teleportation technology. A quick note on teleportation tech, by the way. The Guard does have access to this technology as well, but it is limited in its capabilities in terms of range, reliability, and numbers transported, meaning it is rarely used for offensive actions in battle. Dropping 20 guardsmen onto an enemy ship via teleportation isn't going to cause too much damage, but 20 Blood Angels? Well, that's a different matter entirely. But back to the Astartes. The drop pods are of course just that. Armoured pods dropped from orbit and directed in the rough direction of the target via correctional thrusters on the pod and accelerated via the means of a big-ass jet engine on top of the pod. I went over this in detail in my drop pod video, so if you want further details you can go over there. But this has the advantage of creating a means of delivery that is both extremely small and extremely fast, thereby making it very, very hard indeed to shoot that one down. And of course, as with all things Astartes, this thing is built like a brick wrapped in steel inside of a safe, so the most common means of AA, namely airburst or flak, has very little effect on it. Additionally, the pod sheds parts of its hull during its entry into the atmosphere, creating a dozen sensor contacts per drop pod to confuse guided weapons like missiles. The downside is that the pod has very limited maneuverability once it enters the atmosphere and is unable to carry out any course corrections or evasive maneuvers. Oh, and of course, there's the small matter of the landing. An unaugmented human wouldn't survive the drop itself, and much less the landing, and so this means of planetary deployment is only used by the Astartes. And certain elements of the Inquisition, but we'll get into that later, in another video probably. However, this episode is supposed to be about the more normal elements of the Imperium, and so it is about time we return to the humans. And we're not quite done with the Imperial Navy yet, as we also need to mention the Imperial Air Force's role in all of this. The Air Force, as a separate branch, does not exist in the Imperial Army. Instead, they are part of the Imperial Navy, and most pilots serve both as void fighters and atmospheric pilots. The only exception to this rule is the PDF, the Planetary Defense Force, where the Air Force is placed under the control of the local PDF commander rather than the local system defense commander, unless this is a full-on Navy posting, which is very rare, and are therefore technically a part of the local army. Due to their dual nature, the pilots of the Imperial Navy have already been heavily involved in the Void War, using heavy fighters and bombers to attack enemy ships. These heavy crafts, though, have very little in common with the atmospheric brethren, and though some models of Imperial machines are used both in the Void and in atmosphere, the heavier versions are preferred for void fighting due to their increased firepower and, of course, the sheer size of the targets. A 1,000-pound bomb might put a serious dent in even the heaviest of tanks, but it will be little more than an inconsequential inconvenience to anything but the smallest of escort ships. A 1-kilometer-long torpedo, on the other hand, is one hell of an inconvenience. It should also be mentioned that some Imperial captains and admirals let certain ships under their command take on specialized roles as a void or atmospheric carriers. This specialization is often frowned upon, as the Imperial Navy needs to remain a flexible force to respond to the varied demands of the Imperium, but at the same time, it cannot be denied that zipping around in space and on a planet are two entirely different things, and units specialized in one field or the other naturally proves to be pretty damn good at it. As for their role in land warfare, they act much like air forces do in the modern day, using fighters to protect their own troops and landing forces, and bomber formations, while the bombers and ground attack aircraft engage the enemy's ground troops. One significant deviation, though, is that these aerial forces are very rarely employed for strategic purposes, like the bombing of cities or industrial centers. They are instead primarily used, almost in fact entirely, in a tactical role. The reason for this is quite simple. Any target that would be worth bombing, a strategic target, is almost certainly large enough to be effectively engaged from orbit. And if it has the defenses to resist an orbital bombardment, then one carried out from bombers will almost certainly be entirely pointless. The only real exception to this rule is if the target in question is too valuable to glass from orbit, destroying it entirely, but not quite valuable enough not to bomb it. And even this bombing would almost certainly be carried out as a supporting element in an assault by other Imperial forces, rather than an organized strategic bombing campaign. There are, of course, exceptions, for example, with an enemy whose infrastructure is highly spread out, like for example with the Eldar. The Imperial Air Force would certainly be very, very interested in seeing if they could locate potential Eldar webways and therefore cut off their reinforcements, but again, it's a very special situation, so meh. So, now that we've looked at how the Imperium might attack a planet, let's see how the Imperium might defend one. Firstly, and most obviously, the best way to stop an enemy from invading your planet is to kill them before they reach your planet. Sadly, this is easier said than done. The Imperium is a very, very large place, and the Imperial Navy, although it contains hundreds of thousands of ships, although very few of them are actually capital ships, it could never cover more than a fraction of it at once. In fact, only the most strategically important worlds would ever be considered for permanent posting of Imperial Navy ships. Virtually all Imperial planets have to make do with the ships of the local PDF, and these ships are rarely more than gunboats, designed to police the space lanes in the solar system and fight off minor pirate incursions. It should come as no surprise that these ships will be unable to offer anything but symbolic resistance to any fleet that comes prepared to invade a planet. There are, however, as always, some exceptions. Some planets that have been deemed too valuable to guard with such meager means, but not quite important enough for the Navy, these planets will be guarded by what is commonly referred to as a System Fleet, or SNDF, System Navy Defense Force, and will consist of a few proper ships, mostly light cruisers, with a single cruiser or sometimes heavy cruiser as the flagship. Again, though, this fleet is not expected to engage and destroy an enemy force. It certainly doesn't have that kind of firepower, but unlike the smaller gunboats, these system forces are supposed to have the speed and firepower to slow down and, in the best case scenario, maybe even divert an enemy fleet away from its intended target, buying time for the Imperial Navy to arrive and hopefully drive off the opposition. Disappointment, however, is most certainly a part of life in the 41st millennium, and a lot of the time the gloriously dressed officers of the Imperial Navy and their massive spacefaring penis extensions never even arrive. Communication in the 40k universe is dodgy at the best of times, and there's simply no guarantee that a planet's cry for help is heard, and even if it is, travelling across the endless void of space is a time-consuming affair. And then of course there's the simple fact that the Imperial battle fleets usually just don't sit around with their thumbs up their arse, and so finding ships available to go to a planet's aid on short notice is hard enough in and of itself, and finding enough ships to make a difference is even harder. So, while the best course of action is to destroy the enemy in space, all but the most naive of Imperial regions fortify their worlds with a planetary siege in mind. This preparation varies from world to world depending on available resources and of course on how many angry neighbours are likely to stop by and ask for sugar. For example, a Corewoods world will in most cases rely entirely on orbital defences, be they orbital weapons platforms or planetside anti-ship weapons, to keep the enemy at bay until the might of Battlefleet Solar can come to their rescue. These defences are fairly cheap as far as massive weapon platforms go, and are by far the most unintrusive way of fortifying a planet. As an extra bonus, these platforms are also often used for mercantile purposes. In higher risk systems, the orbital platforms will usually forego this bonus in favour of even more guns and hangars. As for the orbital itself, they can vary greatly in size and potency, from minor gun platforms designed to keep nosy civilians out of certain close orbit areas, to fully militarized platforms boasting firepower to rival the gargantuan Imperial battleships. In a somewhat more high-risk system even than that, these orbital platforms usually only represent the outer layers of a planet's active defenses. Beneath them, on the planet itself, there will be further layers of fortifications. On a relatively lightly defended world, this usually means the hives themselves. I'll have to make a separate video on Imperial hives, which will probably be the topic for next week, but Basically, hives can vary greatly in their defensive capabilities from merely impenetrable to nigh on impossible to attack. And perhaps most important of all, the hives are usually equipped, or in fact virtually always equipped, with void shield generators that can be used to protect the planet's defenders. In the case of especially valuable locations like armory worlds, the already considerable defenses of a fortified and void-shielded settlement will be supplemented with several lines of defenses radiating from a central point of resistance. Again, these defenses could be something as simple and temporary as lines of trenches, all the way up to the endless bunker complexes with fortified trenches and firing placements for heavy guns and flak batteries. To put this into perspective, I suggest taking a look at Cadia, a true fortress world whose primary reason for existing is to halt chaos incursions launched from the Eye of Terror. The worst of these incursions, the so-called Black Crusades, can be compared to the Crusades of pre-heresy times, where entire legions of Adeptus Legionis would descend on a world in the name of Terra and the Emperor. This is a virtually unstoppable force that conquered the galaxy for humanity, and yet Cadia has never fallen. There has been 13 such crusades, and yet still Cadia stands. The Imperium knows how to build defenses. They have got a lot of practice, after all. Then we have the Planetary orbital defense weapons. These usually take the forms of massively, heavily fortified silos within which lays banks of orbital-capable torpedoes and super-heavy lance batteries. Next to hives, these installations are usually amongst the most heavily defended locations on a planet, as the weapons kept inside their massive bunkers are more than capable of denying enormous areas of space to the enemy and to support friendly fleets with a planet's worth of firepower. During the Great Crusade, there existed fleets so massive and containing ships of such insane destructive potential that they were capable of dueling directly with such defenses. But in the modern days of the 41st millennium, this level of firepower is extraordinarily rare, and most segmentums can only lay claim to owning one or two of these monsters, and as such, the by far easiest way to deal with these defenses is to do it on the ground with troops. Lastly, some planets have more specialized forms of defensive weapons. For example, a water world might use a home-built fleet. The Imperial Guard, or Navy, does not employ any ocean-going vessels, at least not officially. But some PDF forces utilize surface fleets of ships, although most planets with smaller oceans will use fleets almost entirely consisting of submarines and small escort carriers. The reason for this is that a large surface fleet is quite simply too easy to spot and target from orbit, and if the fleet spreads out over an area large enough to make it hard to detect and engage, then they will be too far away from one another to offer support and will be vulnerable to enemy aircraft. A submarine fleet neatly avoids this problem simply by not being seen. Other worlds utilizes far more insane ways to defend themselves, like, for example, massive walking cities traversing a toxic wasteland on long, stilted legs. Or a world so completely polluted by millennia of industry that what little remains of the population all live on large flying cities protected by innumerable anti-air guns. The fact of the matter is that the Imperium is a large place, so I've only really covered the basics here, but the rest will have to wait for another time. Specifically, the on-ground tactics of the Imperial Guard is something I want to be covering in its own video. Probably I'll be making a small series on that, because the thing is, it's impossible to give you the basic tactics of an Imperial Guard regiment, because there aren't any really basic tactics. Almost every single regiment has some form of difference in their doctrine, be it they prefer heavier troops, be it they prefer lighter troops, Perhaps they prefer using lots of APCs. Perhaps they prefer using artillery. Perhaps they really dislike tanks. Perhaps they're religious zealots that think that their faith in the God Emperor is enough to protect them. Perhaps they come from an extremely rich world with tons of resources, which allows the troops to be outfitted and geared in the best way possible. Perhaps they come from a really, really poor world, where they're simply used as cannon fodder. Hell, perhaps they're even a penal legion that is literally used as cannon fodder, you know? It is simply far too much stuff to cover consistently in a single video, or hell, even a series of videos, so what I'm probably going to do is to just take various examples and make lore videos out of, you know, unique situations, like for example the Cadian Doctrine, or the Meridian Iron Guard, etc, etc, etc. But until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you soon. Have a good day.